Hello everyone. We wanted to talk today about the problem of evil, which is chapter 7. Can't be with you to talk about it, so I'm going to put something on YouTube and you can look it up there. And we've mentioned this in passing before. Hope all of you are doing well, by the way, and staying out of harm's way. And so the problem of evil, going back to Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC, states that if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, whence evil? Why is there evil in the world? If you take what the chapter calls the logical problem of evil, then you think that those attributes, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, are inconsistent even with the existence of God. That is not the only way to interpret it. He goes into, at that point in the chapter, what it means to have a contradiction. Of course, a contradiction, an inconsistency would be something like it's raining and it's not raining in the same place at the same time. That would be a logical inconsistency. It's not logically inconsistent in the same manner to say that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, and yet there's evil in the world. Those two things can be made to agree in some way. So they're not inconsistent in the way that the raining and not raining contradiction is inconsistent. So what do we have then? So what you do have is, if you have those attributes, that God has infinite goodness, infinite power, and infinite knowledge, then how is it that he's allowed evil in the world? And we shouldn't go past what evil means. You should pause on what is meant by evil traditionally in the history of philosophy. Evil tends to be subdivided into natural evils and willed evils. Natural evils are the sort of evils that you find with disasters. So would be hurricanes, mudslides, tsunamis, typhoons, but also plagues, whether they be the Black Plague or things that are not as a result of human agency, but seem to be cataclysms in nature. You could also say, however, that some of them are, in a sense, human. If a 3-year-old has leukemia, certainly it is not a result of any willing that that led to that, then that could fall under the category of natural evil. I would argue that it does. Then on the other hand, you have the willed evils. And willed evils tend to be, John Stuart Mill summed it up brilliantly by saying, man's inhumanity to man. What we do to one another. So these are things that result from human free will, hence the name willed evils. So they could be warfare, murder, treachery, rape, all the things that are inhumane but are perpetrated by human beings and thus don't fall into the first category of natural evils. So on the one hand, you have, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, spanning some nearly 3,000 years, 2000 BC to the advent of Islam in 600, you have people defining God, as we've been defining him throughout this course, as a being with infinite goodness, infinite power, and infinite knowledge. On the other hand, allowing these evils to exist. This is a hard thing to reconcile. How could a being who cares that much be capable of allowing this sort of evil in the world? The one defense that's often used, going back nearly 2,000 years, to St. Augustine, who patrician father, church father, who lived from 354 to 430 AD, his idea is to use what is called the free will defense. He said, in effect, that a supreme being would have allowed humanity free will, because we would not be fully human without it. We'd be in some sense robotic without this free will. And so better that the being would allow free will, even knowing that with free will there was a chance of choosing good and evil, and that people would choose the latter just as they would choose the former. So this is the free will defense. That's the most prominent defense. I'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to list the other defenses of so-called evil in the world. Another evil says there has to be a kind of balance of good and evil. We wouldn't know what good was unless it was intermixed with evil. And so just as we wouldn't know what darkness was unless it was contrasted with light, wouldn't know what hot was unless it was contrasted with cold. So these opposites are necessary for us to even understand what good is. And so it's the good is evil is a kind of necessary complement to goodness. A third so-called solution to the problem of evil, or defense of evil, by the way, the philosophical term for defending God of the charge of evil is called theodicy. This is the term you see in theology that comes up. It's theodicy, or defense of God. Another defense of evil that's used is that evil is somehow a necessary byproduct of nature. This too is Augustinian. Because St. Augustine said that matter itself is corruptible. So that he's kind of Platonic in this. Very much he's a Neoplatonist. He says in effect that immaterial things, spiritual things, are immutable, just like Plato's forms. And they are not parts of this world. They are immaterial in nature, and so not corruptible. But matter, by contrast, though, is constantly in flux. This goes back to the Heraclitean idea, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers that Plato subscribed to, that material nature is by its very nature changeable and imperfect. So, therefore, when you have a material universe, it's bound to break down at certain points. There are going to be mudslides and earthquakes and cataclysms, and these things are just part of the nature of the universe itself. So, in that sense, evil is a necessary byproduct of nature, because nature itself is corruptible, as the argument goes. A fourth defense of the problem of evil is that God had no choice but to make the world that He did. He had to have created this world. He could have created no other. I'm going to come back to them now serially, and let's start with the first one, the problem of the free will defense of evil. Augustine has used it, and many people have used it since. I used to subscribe to this idea. Yes, it is important that you have free will, and if you didn't have free will, but instead, let's say, had some chip in your brain, and that chip led you to choose goodness all the time, then you would not be choosing good at all. If, strictly speaking, the word choice wouldn't apply. You'd be forced to choose goodness instead of evil. And so this would be a diminution of your free will, and no supreme being would want it. So free will, in this sense, is often raised to the level of this absolute good, unconditional good. I don't think so. My view of this is that, I'm going to make an analogy for you. If someone were to ask you to watch their child for a day and show them a good time because they would be away, and say you took the child into town, you're going to take them to the stores and that, and take them out for a meal, and then crossing a busy intersection, you let go of their hand. And the 5-year-old child ran out and got hit by a car. Survived it, but you then come back to the parent of that child and say, well, I was just allowing the child free will. This is, free will is not necessarily a good thing in this case. You should have anticipated that the child would misuse his will. Your intelligence is greater than that of the child, which is why the child was put in your care in the first place, and so you should have known better. Well, I think there's a proportion here. As our intelligence is greater than the child's and we should have taken more care, so too a supreme being's intelligence is greater than ours, and that if he has infinite knowledge, then infinite understanding, then many times greater. And so he too should have known that we would misuse our free will. So this idea that free will is some necessary good, when clearly it can go wrong at every turn, is to me not a convincing idea. The second idea, the second defense, that there has to be a balance of good and evil, that seems more persuasive to me, I must say. However, I can imagine that a physical universe in which things always went right was at least a possibility, and not a contradiction. A universe in which there wouldn't be, at least we're talking now about the natural evils, there wouldn't be physical catastrophes. That was at least conceivable for a supreme being to set up a universe in which there wouldn't be volcanoes beneath the ocean floors, which we call tsunamis, or sliding tectonic plates, which we call earthquakes. those things didn't have to exist. Indeed, a supreme being could have made it so that this universe was not corruptible in that way. So that it doesn't have to be an admixture of good and evil. The third idea, the Augustinian idea, again, that evil is a necessary byproduct of nature. Yes, I suppose you could say that. But this goes back to the one I just replied to, the idea that there has to be a mixture of good and evil. It needn't have been the case that matter was corruptible. If God is all-knowing, he knew how to create matter in such a way that it wasn't corruptible. All good he should have cared, and if he was infinitely powerful, he had the might to do so, and yet the universe breaks down at certain points anyway. So the last one, the last that God couldn't have made, the fourth defense of God, or the defense that says that God in effect could not have made a different universe, St. Bonaventure disagreed with that. In fact, St. Bonaventure, who comes before St. Thomas Aquinas, but after St. Augustine and St. Anselm, all we've looked at, and didn't have the same notoriety, in retrospect, not the same fame as them. Bonaventure said, in effect, that a supreme being was free to make any universe he wanted to. That you can't limit God's choice. That, in some sense, is contradictory. If he's all-powerful, his choice is not circumscribed in this way. This goes back to the idea of power and what Swinburne was saying when we were looking at him and what it meant for God to have all power. He can't commit a logical contradiction. He can't make square circles, for example, and he can't make contradictions come true. But he could have made it the case that there was a reverse cubed law of gravity instead of reverse square law as we now have. So he could have been free in this sense to have made a different universe. This is Bonaventure's contention. I'm kind of persuaded by that, to say that not just because I went to St. Bonaventure, but because that idea seems mostly persuasive to me. To say that God couldn't have created any other universe other than the one he did would be to limit his power. So there's the problem of evil and several replies to it. I may revisit this, but I thought you might want to have that talked about a bit before before it's a major problem in theology and philosophy. It's always been regarded as a serious problem for anyone in philosophy. But by the way, I wanted to add one thing about free will. I saw a movie in the early 1970s by the name of A Clockwork Orange. It's based on the book by Anthony Burgess, a now deceased British author. It's a kind of a futuristic and disturbing novel about youth run amok in London and invent their own language. They do terrible things like home break-ins, robberies, rapes, and the sort. Well, one of them is caught, the gang leader, Alex. He's known as one of the four droogs. He's caught and brought to prison. And to reduce his prison sentence, he opts into a program whereby he'll undertake what's called the Ludovico treatment. The Ludovico treatment is a treatment that he is forced to watch violent scenes, gangs setting themselves on an innocent person, beating them up. The Nazis marching the Jews off to the gas chamber. And in the background of these films that he's forced to watch, they have his eyes kept open with these devices, is Beethoven playing in the background, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Fourth Movement, which he always loved. While he's watching this and can't get out of the view of it, his eyes, as I say, are kept open, he can't swivel his head in any way, he's been given a drug that will make him sick to his stomach, almost non-stop. And so he can't avert his eyes. He now comes to associate the violence that he sees on the screen and the Beethoven that he's listening to with the nauseating feeling. And the nauseating feeling is such that he says he wants to kill himself, he reports later. So this is the idea. Free will here is not really free. He is the idea that he's cured of his, this becomes a political football in this society. Some people who want to control law and order, who want to get voted back into office will say, see, we can cure people in this way. The free will people will say, well, he doesn't really have free will. He's manipulated to do the good as a result of this reconditioning of his behavior modification, if you will, a kind of behaviorism of the kind V.F. Skinner would have subscribed to, the stimulus response idea. So he doesn't really have free will at all. Although people who don't believe in the absolute merits of free will, as I do not, might say still, we got the result of it. We might have created a society of better people. So I wanted to throw that in there too. Some of you might be interested in reading that novel or seeing that movie. It's well worth it. I have the movie, and I've watched it with my wife. I watched it many years ago, and it's a very interesting movie. In fact, it came out the same year The Godfather came out, and I remember The Godfather won all the awards. But the New York Film Critics gave Clockwork Orange the film of the year, which was everyone, as I say, Godfather was sweeping all the awards, but in 1971, I believe it was, Clockwork Orange won the award by the New York Film Critics.